So this was a part of the Jesus movement of the late 70s, and it was part of the Christian counterculture. It was inspired in part by what the hippies and the counterculture did in the 60s, but it did so as an explicitly Christian project. And it wanted to create an alternative lifestyle that was based on very literal reading of the book of Acts and be involved in a strong degree of economic sharing and mutual service and also public ministry. So the biggest and best known aspect of this group's public ministry was a rock and roll band called Servant. And eventually the community was named the Servant Community. And this was a large band, kind of 1980s style rock, and about 7 members. And I was the electrician and pyrotechnician for this group for a period of about 3 years during the early 80s. And they played a couple hundred concerts a year for about 10 years. They were well known on the Christian rock circuit. They put out maybe 7 albums. And they were pretty good. They were good studio band. They were a lot of fun as a live band. So we did a lot of things to try to create a full performance art experience using multimedia, using a laser show. I'd blow up flash pots and indoor fireworks and strobe lights and fog machines and everything to make the kiddies excited. It also, I guess, impressed on me in a kind of almost a subconscious level, because I'm just sort of thinking about it now, 30 years later, thinking about the importance of that experience and connecting it with kind of visual creative culture as a part of this, creating an experience. And in fact, this is very old and traditional within the Franciscan history and other branches of Catholicism. There were Franciscans who there's a fellow, Letter of Port Maurice, who would travel around with 30 donkeys to create something like a Kiss rock and roll show to scare the devil out of them and invite them to change and repent. So Franciscans have been involved in these kind of multimedia events. It's actually a part of who Francis was, right? He sang and danced and was a creative genius and did performance art. But Francis's message initially, I think, was primarily targeted at men and women and families. So I've always felt very uncomfortable with the idea of putting vowed religious order members on pedestals or holding them up. I think it's great. I love this way that we live, and it can be beautiful and inspirational as well as difficult. But I think I don't ever want to let go of that universality, in the sense that Franciscan life is for everybody, for anybody who wants it. There are multiple stages to the process of becoming a vowed religious order member, and they can seem quite daunting if one thinks of this in terms of trying to accomplish something. But in essence, I think, or I would say instead, the best way to frame this as a process. It's a journey, and it's a multi-stage, multi-year journey. And that doesn't mean it should be daunting or repelling. It should be like exciting, like starting a big project. And for me, it took several years. It took almost 4 years from first idea to actually starting the program. 4 years. And I experienced a lot of kind of restlessness and frustration because it felt like it was taking forever for no good reason. But it had its good reasons in its own way. And ultimately, I came to realize that one is a Franciscan when one chooses to follow the gospel in the spirit of St. Francis. And that the brown robe is nice, but that's not necessary. That everyone who chooses to live as a Franciscan can do so by reading the Gospels, by giving good example by service and by prayer. And I think it's important to realize that the vast majority of Franciscans throughout history have not been vowed religious. They've been lay people. And Francis didn't think he was founding a religious order. I don't think. My understanding is that he thought he was founding a lay movement. And then it sort of evolved into something else, which would have these kind of specialized people who did these unusual things that lived outside of the regular family life.
What advice might you offer to to youth who might want to pursue this vocation?
Living as a Franciscan is a great way to live one's human life and to respond to the invitation of God's love. And although the institutions of religious life seem kind of distant or scary and at the same time compelling, I think there's a lot of steps that any young person can do to explore whether or not they want to pursue this as a possible way of living out their lives. I think the most important thing for them to do is to find some real live members of these religious communities and talk to them, and more importantly, listen to them. One of the great advantages of Franciscans is that we have this founder of St. Francis who's enormously popular. Many people experience a great deal of disappointment because they come wanting to live with St. Francis and instead they're stuck living with the Franciscans, and it's not the same. So I think having a human experience, a real person's experience with the religious community members, preferably in their home on their terms, is important. And then I think finding ways in which one can express what's coming up within oneself in terms of prayer and in terms of service is also a really great way to go about testing it. Because somebody has to really want to spend extended periods of time in prayer, community prayer, liturgical prayer, silent prayer, contemplative prayer, and spend a great deal of time doing things that aren't necessarily comfortable or what one would prefer to do, at least from the perspective of the contemporary society. And so there are tremendous sacrifices associated with living as a Franciscan in terms of sacrificing one's own ego and will. But the rewards are immense. So I think there's an inherent characteristic of Franciscan life of that kind of idealism that has an appeal to youth. And I'd like to see us find more ways to get images of Francis, and I'll use that in a general sort of way, images of Francis in front of idealistic youth, because I think that there's a natural attraction there, but they have to be brought into at least a perceptual relationship. And I think that from how I make sense of it is this is really a seed growing period, a seed planting period in college, where it took a lot to get them out of their parents' home and learning, thinking about their own identity and their own religious identity only in relationship to their family unit. And now they have to kind of discover faith again for the first time as adults and make some decisions about what kind they want to have and how they want to pursue that. And I think my read is that that's what is necessary at this stage in their life when they're with me, taking classes with me, that in the future they'll be able to know some things about what this tradition within Catholicism has to offer, and that will be valuable to them. When I left school as a freshman, I joined this ecumenical lay community, and within a period of about 6 months, I found myself in apple orchards of Washington State, picking apples and pears. So that was part of our strategy for supporting ourselves in this lay community. So I went from suburban California to living in a migrant farm worker camp, and that gave me a different perspective on reality than I'd had growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I did that for 5 seasons, picking 2, 3, 4 months a year in Oregon, California, Washington. So I developed a great sense of solidarity with people who are manual laborers, not only in agriculture, but also in forestry, because I also, during the same 5 years, in the winter and spring, we'd plant trees. So we'd plant trees winter, spring, and pick apples and pears late summer and fall. And so I had been interested in questions having to do with agriculture. I like to eat, and then when I became interested in joining the Friars in California, I discovered that there was this history that was really just starting to wind down about the time I was joining 20 years ago. And after I'd been a friar for about 10 years, I remember wanting to strike up a conversation with one of the older members of our community who had been centrally involved in that relationship, who was a former provincial, and he couldn't remember anymore. So that gave me a strong sense of urgency that I better do something about this. So in the midst of doing my dissertation, while I was driving all over California interviewing people about sustainable agriculture, I was also interviewing people about the contact between the Franciscans and the farm worker movement as a social movement. So I interviewed Cesar Chavez's son, Dolores Huerta, other people who were involved with the UFW, and of course I interviewed a dozen or 50 or 20 of my own religious order members. And what became clear to me as a result of this is that it was a multi-decade relationship that was based on mutual interest, and that what the poor people's movement of the UFW meant for us was to take the notion of solidarity with people who are poor and marginalized out of the realm of books and ideas and into the enfleshed bodies of members of our own neighborhoods and communities and parishes. So for us, this was a great gift, and it changed us, and it gave us part of our own character as West Coast Franciscans, because there were some people who read the documents of Vatican II, other Franciscans, other religious order members in other places, and they said, that's interesting. And we read the documents of Vatican II and talking about a more engaged forms of spirituality, and we said, those are the people who need us. And in fact, they're inspiring us. And this isn't an idea or a concept, it's a human being. These are human beings that are struggling to make their lives better. And we should stop talking about all of these Franciscan values and put some of them into practice. And so that's what we went about doing, learning from them. Luis Valdez, the founder of El Teatro Campesino, is essentially a neighbor in San Juan Bautista. I remember once, for several years, I taught a class called The Moral Vision of Cesar Chavez. And this was a very valuable class to teach. I enjoyed it a great deal because instead of talking about Catholic social teaching principles as abstractions, I talked about them in the context of a social movement. And I would have I brought the El Teatro Campesino to come and give a presentation in my class. To other students, I took them to see La Virgen de Guadalupe as a part of their annual Advent presentation. I would just like to say this about that class, about the moral vision of Cesar Chavez. I would say that if I've done anything good for anybody, there are a couple of students in a couple of those classes, that would be one of them. Especially for first-generation Latino and Latina kids, it made a huge difference. I had one student who said, yes, she was a first-generation college student, and she's now in a nurse practitioner program at Stanford, Alejandra. And she's a senior, and she took it as an elective. She didn't have to. But she said to me, this is the first class in 4 years I've been at Santa Clara where I felt like being a Latino gave me an advantage. Every other class, I felt like I was a step behind because I was Hispanic. This one, I understand what he's saying. In fact, those consuelos that he heard from his mother, from his grandmother, that Cesar Chavez learned, that's what I got too. This validates me. So for somebody who's worked in very low-income communities with a lot of distressed families, to be able to work with first-generation kids in my classroom and provide a space where they can feel like their ways of knowing and their own history and identity are validated, that was immensely fulfilling for me as a Franciscan. Father Joe Kenichi is the former minister provincial of the St. Barbara province during the 90s, and he is the president of the Franciscan School of Theology. He is a historian with a doctoral degree from Oxford, and he is, in my opinion, one of the leading figures in Franciscan thought in the world. Not so much because he is a specialist only in Franciscan medieval thought, which that's not exactly his field of interest, but it has become one of his primary areas of inquiry. He's he's done more work recently on American Catholic history more generally. But what's important to know about Joe is that he's somebody who has shown us as Franciscans how to integrate our Franciscan intellectual tradition with the needs of lived Franciscan experience today in America. And for that, I'm profoundly grateful to him because he has he has, by his example and by his articulation, been able to model for us what it means to link our intellectual skills with our religious commitments. And he's um, he's able to he's able to construct, if I think that's the right term, he's able to construct a project which links our patrimony as Franciscans with what we can and could and should do today in the 21st century. I think that the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition Retrieval Project was conceived in the recreation room at the Franciscan School of Theology at 1712 Euclid, up on the third floor. And it was probably done during a time when the guys were just sitting back and saying, how come nobody's paying attention to our ideas? Why do we Franciscans seem to be marginalized within the church in terms of our perspectives? Why is it that we feel like um, what we understand our history to have been as a tradition, making tremendous contributions to the broader church? Why doesn't no one seem to recognize that? So part of the problem was it wasn't organized and packaged right. And as from what I can tell, the three principals that were there were Joe Kenichi, Bill Short, and Kenan Osborne. Perhaps Mike Guinan was there too. I'm not sure. But that was like the earliest stages, maybe 12, 15 years ago. And so this was this took place shortly after I finished my MA in theology with emphasis in spirituality, and Bill Short, who is presently the dean of FST, and Joe Kenichi, who's currently the president, they were my committee chair and committee member for my master's thesis. So I absorbed a terrific amount from them as a young friar, and they challenged me, not explicitly, but just by their example of using intellectual skills in service of the fraternity. Because I wasn't really paying attention to this. I mean, I did pretty well as a student, but it wasn't something that I thought of myself as wanting to become an intellectual leader. But as a result of that work, the two of them have really shown that it's possible and important. My own special areas of interest are in Franciscan natural history or Franciscan science, a form of medieval science. So for this, I've been investigating a couple of key figures. They're important for Franciscan history, but also for the history of science and the history of the development of Western thought about culture. Allow me to explain. So Roger Bacon is perhaps the best known, and he was a friar who lived in the 1200s at the University of Oxford in Paris, and he is considered the architect of what would become the modern scientific method. He was the first one who began to articulate the notion of testing hypotheses. He didn't actually do what we would call modern science, but he laid out the philosophical foundation for it. And hardly anyone even knows that he was a Franciscan. It's not just that people in general don't know he was a Franciscan, it's that Franciscans don't know he was a Franciscan, nor has anyone, until myself, as far as I can tell, asked what was Franciscan about him, and in what ways does he represent some kind of intuition of St. Francis. Likewise with Bernardino de Sahagún, this really very important founder of modern ethnography. He anticipated all of the major tools in ethnography 200 years before anthropology was created as a field. And he did so as a Franciscan missionary. And so he actually articulated a methodology for conducting inquiry with a novel culture, a new culture. Well, people talk about him as a Franciscan. They know he's a Franciscan, but no one's ever asked, well, what's Franciscan about him? Or is there some influence of Franciscan life that found expression in the methodological innovations that he created to do this work? And we don't have direct evidence of that, but I think that's really important. So we can think about Franciscan theorizing about economics and political theory and about the nature of ethics. So all of these fields are a part of this Franciscan way of trying to bring a Franciscan spirit, Francis's spirit, and translate that into our contemporary means. In some ways, what we can think of the pioneering Franciscan intellectual figures as retrieving Francis's spirituality and being able to translate it to where they were in the late 13th century or 14th century, or in New Spain in the 16th century. So they were, in essence, retrieving Francis's spirit and linking it with the contemporary needs. So we're just doing the same thing. But I think understanding the breadth of interest of Franciscans is very important, and I think justifies the claim of this as an intellectual tradition within a broader current of of Catholic intellectual life.
Come, Jesus, come, I'm ready. Come, Jesus, come, and show me your way, your truth, your life. Patiently, you stood by, watching me with each try that I made to make it on my own. Now, as I stand amidst my shattered dreams, somehow I think for the first time, yes, I really believe I'm ready to accept your love.